Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Alina McKay, and I'm the research manager for Balanced Supply of Housing. We're a research node with a focus on addressing the need for the right to housing in Canada's urban centres, including Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. We're housed at the UBC's Peter Allard School of Law and led by Alexander Flynn and funded by SSHRC CMHC. On behalf of BHS, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's Research in Progress webinar to focus on Toronto Chinatown Pathways to Housing Security through Collective Ownership. We're excited to take a deeper dive into recent research on how the Community Land Trust model supports affordability, cultural heritage, and long-term community stability in the neighborhood. So before we begin, I'd just like to make a quick note that this session is being recorded and will be available in our website in the coming days. You can find more information about the webinar in the chat. There'll be a link for you. Starting with the land acknowledgement, we are hosting today's webinar from the stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in so-called Vancouver. Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted by housing inequities as a direct result of colonial violence. And so we encourage you to consider where you live, work, and play, and how the land stewarded by Indigenous folks longer than written history plays an important role in your life. Before we get into it, let me go over a few quick housekeeping items. Please use the question and answer function to submit your questions. We'll dedicate time at the end of the webinar for discussion with our presenter, Chiyi Tam. You can also use the question and A section if you have any technical issues, and we'll reach out directly to support you. To read along, you can also enable live captioning by clicking the CC option below. You also have the option of translate captions into another language of your choice. So with that, I'll start with a quick introduction. I'll introduce myself, Alina McKay. So I'm the research manager with the Balanced Supply of Housing. We are like I've mentioned before, a research node that works in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver with nonprofit partners and community groups across in all of those cities. We also do a lot of work with the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts, including supporting their national summit, and also which Chiyi is on the board of Community Network of Community Land Trust board. And I'm excited to be your host for today's webinar and to help guide you through the important conversation on collective ownership and housing justice in Toronto's Chinatown. Chiyi Tam is our expert today. She's an urban planner and anti-displacement organizer practicing in Toronto Kensington-Chinatown neighborhood. She is currently a visiting expert with the School of Cities as an early career Canadian urban leader. Most relevant to today's webinar, Chiyi is the managing director of the recently established Toronto Chinatown Land Trust, and her goal is to reciprocate knowledge and wealth into community ownership. Today, we're spotlighting community-led research focused on Toronto Chinatown Land Trust, which is the community partner organization for the research project we'll be discussing. It's an emerging initiative to protect affordability and cultural identity in one of Canada's most iconic neighborhoods. This work is part of the Balanced Supply of Housing's research into innovating models for non-market housing, including community land trusts. Through our research, BSH seeks to reshape how land is used and valued, moving beyond market-driven models towards approaches that prioritize community stability and self-determination. In particular, this stream of research focuses on the potential of CLTs as tools to resist displacement, preserve cultural heritage, and ensure long-term housing affordability. For those who are less familiar with community land trusts, or a CLT as it's commonly referred to, CLTs are nonprofit organizations that acquire and hold land in trust for the benefit of community. The land is removed from the speculative market and used to provide permanent, affordable housing, community space, or other public benefits. Residents typically own or rent their homes depending on the jurisdiction and legal definition of a CLT in that country, but the CLT retains ownership of the land, ensuring long-term affordability and local control. If you are really curious and want to learn more about CLTs in Canada, visit our website at bsh.ubc.ca/research-CLT. In addition to the research we're looking at today, we have several projects exploring CLTs, and we invite you to take a look at our recent policy profile series, which we've published in our partnership with Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts. Today, we're thrilled to be able to share insight into two key studies. The first, Who Owns Chinatown, led by Kuni Kamizaki, who's an assistant professor at the School of Community and Regional Planning here at UBC, maps existing affordable housing stock in Toronto's Chinatown to inform strategies for housing preservation and acquisition through a CLT mobilization. The second, Community-Owned Housing in Toronto's Chinatown, led by Julie Ma, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Geography at University of Toronto, builds on this work by seeking to understand the role of traditional family associations in Chinatown's current housing affordability landscape. Taken together, this research helps us understand how land already held in community can be leveraged as a foundation for inclusive, stable communities. With that, let me hand it over to Chi.
Hi. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to come hear about what we've been up to. I will say this is the first time that we've organized the interim findings of our research projects with BSH in this format and in this manner. So thank you all for, especially members that I'm seeing in the chat, for taking the time. And thank you again to both Sarah and Alina for being really supportive research partners. And you're going to hear a lot more about why exactly it is that we are doing research. Let me share some slides that I've prepared for you all. So both of our research projects with BSH are technically in progress, although one is pretty substantively done and actually directly fed into the second one. So I'm going to try and tell you the story of how our land trust came to be through these research projects. I also am hoping to explain a little bit about our research approach and how it fits into our organizing strategy overall. And then lastly, hopefully you leave with a sense of clarity about why we are asking the questions we are asking, and also that you feel also empowered to initiate research projects in the way that we have. So my name is Chiyi Tam, my pronouns are she and her. I'm the managing director of the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust, which is to say that I was the first staff to be hired after a group of all of us who were volunteers as a working group as part of a radical grassroots group called Friends of Chinatown Toronto, who was fighting gentrification and some pretty alarming site proposals in downtown Toronto, put together a working group, and we as a group now have formed the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust. So that origin story is important because it made this research partnership possible and also made this room possible. So this is a photo from last year's annual general meeting where voting members of the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust have the right to elect the new board, vote on any referendums or major issues, and members who don't have voting status, who have opted to join in other tiers of membership, go just to reconnect, learn what we're up to, and get involved with various committees and projects in the neighborhood. So hopefully you can see how diverse the crowd is, how lovely and smiley and hopeful everybody is. And I do find that working on community land trust and being in the community land trust space, hope is a real theme where we live, it feels like, in a very despairing environment and news cycle, but being together with people on projects like a community land trust has been a reoccurring sustainable source of hope for us. So this room is possible because of an overall organizing strategy where we identified that we wanted to initiate a community land trust as one tool in and amongst a broader idea that we needed to be fighting for greater community power and control in Chinatown. So this is a graph we use just to show the layers of how we think about the impact of using a community land trust. And you can see that the community land trust as a tool is in the center, but only one component. The thing that we like the most about the community land trust is that it has democratic governance. It's really made by the people for the people. And from there, it cascades a whole bunch of effects depending on the practices of your land trust, depending on the projects you take on. Overall, you're trying to use goal for specifically community needs. And from there, hopefully exert a greater degree of community power and control. But underneath all of this, you can see in the bottom layer, it really has to be grounded in political neighborhood organizing and mutual aid, deep, deep mutual aid, where people really are organizing side by side with tenants for power, with workers for power, in a working class neighborhood context, rather than just abstract, feel good cultural work just for the sake of doing cultural retention, without that underpinning of a working class strategy. So we had this clarity because we had done a feasibility study, as a group called Friends of Chinatown Toronto many years before we met the BSH group. But from there, we were introduced to one researcher who is part of the balanced supply of housing node named Kuni Kumizaki, who now is a professor at UBC, but then we knew him as a PhD student, or sorry, not PhD student, a postdoctoral fellow at U of T. So we met in downtown Toronto because he was one of the founders of Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust. And his positionality as a researcher introduced this idea to us as Friends of Chinatown Toronto that, hey, you guys are asking these really sophisticated questions, and you need to identify and verify and establish the needs of the community in order to come forward with a proposal and a rationale for why Chinatown is suitable for a community land trust, why there's a logic to it. Document that. You have been doing community organizing, but you can also construe it as research. Let me convince you why using research as a framework actually is also mutually reinforcing with your organizing strategy. So he taught us this whole world of methodology, that really the step-by-step guide is available from a group called Take Root Justice in New York, that's connected with a lot of neighborhood organizing groups that we really are very aligned with just south of the border. And roughly, if you look at the steps of what research as organizing, which is to say participatory action research or community-led action research, it really resonated with us because it was intuitive. It was easy for a lot of folks who had never gone to university to quickly understand, oh yeah, we have organizing goals in the neighborhood. We have a target. We can turn that into a core question and go around the neighborhood with all sorts of different methods to verify and ask people what their response to those research questions would be. So then we decided what we wanted to do. And the thing we extra loved about this is it actually let us use research funds as a way to train our own organizers and our own peers and recruit aunties and uncles and youth in the neighborhood to conduct this research, to be the ones conducting the field surveys, to be the ones going and knocking on doors, canvassing, to do tenant surveys, to have those conversations live in the bodies of the members who will continue to be invested in our work and continue to one day maybe become a board member of the TCLT was something that we just thought was a cherry on top, bonus factor. So from there, you then establish what your findings are, and then you share that back with the community in all sorts of methods, presentations like this, research reports. But overall, we do come out of it with a particular angle to verify, hey, we had this organizing goal. We now know what our ask is to community, to politicians, to people in power. And we turn that into a communication strategy for a policy platform after. So why were we asking any questions at all? For Friends of Chinatown, the context was building changes that looked like this. I won't go into the deeper history of it, but intuitive to everybody, the before and after photo is drastic. So imagine the emotional response of the neighborhood after we had already lost that previous before and after photo I just showed you. Then we saw a development notice go up for 315 to 325 Spadina, which was a one-story commercial building that was serving so many diverse, culturally specific needs in the community. A Vietnamese optometrist that my friend Nick had grown up going to, Rolsan's original location at this section of Spadina that many people were very familiar with and nostalgic for, and so on and so forth, is now currently under construction, but at the time was merely a proposal. And so one of the classic City of Toronto blue signs had gone up with this big notice word that nobody understood. It directed you to a link that was very hard to understand, and then told you there was going to be a public consultation meeting where your voice was not going to be heard. And also the meeting itself would be very difficult to find. So Friends of Chinatown Toronto, along with a group of artists that at that time, there was a project called T-Base, put together these like art parodies and all sorts of Instagram mobilizations in response to the city planning system. And they were extremely successful. The level of engagement from Friends of Chinatown and the current following that they still have grown even more momentum and support for their vision of Chinatown, which is rooted in anti-displacement work, rooted in a solidarity with tenant and working class people, to turn all of this second and third wave, Asian Canadian energy into an incredibly effective, politically active, mobilized contingent was scary. It was something that the city planning system had not really seen to this degree. And I think people were really shocked. We're really, really shocked at how able they were to fill rooms and to antagonize powers that be. So all of this is happening. That's the context. The history context that elder activists in Toronto's Chinatown were sharing with the group Friends of Chinatown Toronto at the time was, this is not our first rodeo. There have been many generations of people who have been fighting to save Chinatown, fighting specific development proposals, and the most large scale and egregious trauma that the community holds is a particular proposal, which you now know as the new Toronto City Hall, where it currently stands. Before it was Nathan Phillips Square, it was the ward, and the last stewards of the ward were largely where Toronto's first Chinatown was, I should say. This move to go and expropriate almost all of First Chinatown without public consultation meant that the vast majority of our housing, our residential footprint, which is not on the main avenues of Dundas, University, Spadina, that you would know as commercial corridors, the housing behind those commercial corridors was almost entirely erased. And so then the idea of a Chinatown no longer is affiliated with housing. Now in modern times, most people think of a Chinatown as a commercial concept full of retail stores and businesses, but in fact, it was a complete neighborhood. So that's the context to why they started asking these questions. Project one with BSH was, who owns Chinatown? Okay, you've established and identified that there is a consensus that you guys want to ask a question about what would a community land trust look like? You've already done the feasibility, it would work. What would be the opening moves of your community land trust? So our first project proposal was to use this research as organizing framework with CUNY and work with Friends of Chinatown to not only get the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust incorporated and real on paper, but also to basically do its strategic planning. Project two responded to a very curious happenstance encounter that occurred during our tenant canvassing process in Project One, that then exploded into a whole other project that's currently still underway in the middle of its writing. Many of the research assistants are currently in the audience. I'm very nervous presenting to you. But that project is called Community-Owned Housing in Toronto's Chinatown, who our research partner is Professor Julie Ma at U of T, where we're investigating the existing community ownership models, not to say that we're bringing a new model in with this idea of a community land trust. In fact, you can find an abundance, a shocking abundance of housing inventory already owned under a collective ownership model. And the reason we worked with Julie was she had heard one of our presentations about our prior project, and Julie came up to me after an event, a BSH event, I'm pretty sure, I don't totally remember, and she was like, I grew up in Montreal's Chinatown, right? Like I'm known as like an evictions and like tenant, data like researcher, and me for like all these other things in the rental market and housing. But actually, like I remember going with my uncle to the Ma Association in Montreal's Chinatown. They had housing upstairs. I remember paying $20 each time onto our ledger each week. We were a member. I want to look into that. And so then that became that research project. So I'll dive into the details of some of what we did and some of the findings, which I'm sure the members in the audience will find interesting. So project one, who owns Chinatown, we're near the end of wrapping it up now. The core research question is, what would the first focus for a Chinatown-focused community land trust be? Which is in another way to ask, what are our community's housing needs, really? And so from there were four kind of prongs of this. We knew that we had anti-colonial values. So what would it mean for us to engage in a strategy that basically means you're owning land? Owning land on stolen land seemed like an inherently tense relationship. And we wanted to go take time through this research project to understand how other people are thinking about that, because there wasn't yet a really satisfying answer from what we could see in the land trust movement. And then we wanted to clarify what would be our focus in terms of like a vision and mission statement. What would that look like as a strategic plan? And doing that would require you to not only assess the community needs through surveys, but also to analyze the existing threats and opportunities through some mapping processes. And so we've accumulated all of that thinking into what has now become our strategic plan. But some of the stuff that's not in our strategic plan, so this is our strategic plan in summary, there are 3 prongs of strategic priorities. But to skip over that, from the outset, before we had all this conversation, we just wanted to verify the basic assumptions about gentrification. Like, we can yell about gentrification on social media, but like, can you prove that it's happening in Toronto's Chinatown? And yes, you can. You really, really can. The gray colors are 2020. The orange colors are 2015. The blue colors are 2005. And if you took just the dissemination area census data for what we consider West Chinatown, so this doesn't include East Chinatown or other downtown Chinatown contexts for Toronto, you can really see that low-income populations have drastically dropped off. The gray in the lowest left-hand side, income brackets, gone. People making over 100K a year, drastic increase. And that has to do with the kinds of housing developments that are coming into the area, right? Another way of verifying the other end of gentrification is also, what is the racial makeup difference? So you can see that Asians in 2006 as a broad category, orange, absolutely are the dominant group in this area, proving that it is indeed a viable Chinatown. That number seems similar in 2016, but actually it's a drop of 500 people. And we're looking at a total of like hovering less than 10,000 people, right, in this area that I'm interested in. So losing 500 people out of that amount is drastic. It's really drastic. And you can see the amount of, even if the amount of Asian folks has relatively held stable, in your opinion, if you don't think 4,700 is that big of a difference from 4,200, people of European origin, the purple, has more than a 1,000 individual count increase, right? So if you're proving that the neighborhood is both becoming more white and richer, a la gentrification, that is how you would show it. So we were really happy to be able to actually confirm that we weren't, talking out of thin air. The other thing that we didn't expect to find was on either extreme of the age brackets, we were losing a lot of children. So you can see in 2001, 25 years ago, we had almost 1,000 kids living in the neighborhood. It's about half that number now. That's scary. Unintuitively, on the opposite end, people over the age of 85 went from 175 to now 335. So it's single seniors also living alone in this area because it's a last resort, ? That then forms your next more detailed research questions, right? Who is living in Chinatown under those circumstances? So here are some of the examples of focus groups and also community report backs in the interim as that research progressed. We would gather people in the neighborhood and also other allied groups. So here you see like Black Urbanism Toronto represented, the ED of the community center we're meeting in represented, other community land trusts. So Cooney's directly in the center there. Next to him is Josh. Next to him is Josh is from Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, and next to him is Dominique from Kensington Market Community Land Trust, and all of our members and board members hearing our findings. And what this looked like in detail was going to archives and interacting with a terminal that had a screen that looked like this. It was really, really archaic, but it gave us information down to the T of who owned which properties for how long roughly, and where were their mailing addresses, how many tenants were they declaring were living in those addresses, just for us to begin really mapping out, is the ownership structure of Chinatown changing? Because we've already established that the people living, the resident structure has. That we didn't find as much change, thankfully, as we expected, but we did find some patterns in the ownership that we really didn't expect to see. This photo is from a debrief meeting after going out on a field survey with some of our community researchers, some of the multilingual youth that we had hired and trained to work on our first project. So we found, unfortunately, more corporate assemblies than we had expected, which is to say a very large financialized actor, a private equity firm or a real estate investment trust that owned more than 5 properties. We found 5 instances of this. And again, the area I'm describing is tiny. So more than 5 is a lot. that means 4 times 5, more than 20 properties that are co-linked together and ready to be turned into one giant redevelopment proposal. But it was also fun for us to find like families that owned more than 4 properties, like families that see themselves as part of the community, who themselves have a significant and interesting property portfolio. So, and it's interesting, like engaging them and what they think of our strategy, and whether they would see themselves as part of our mission, or whether they imagine their legacy being sold off to one of those private equity actors in the future. And the very last one I'll bring your attention to is this idea of an association and a society. So we found later this number became outdated, actually more than 20 counts of still held under nonprofit ownership associations. We also were able to really demystify this idea of missing middle housing applying to Chinatown specific. So housing people are obsessed with talking about missing middle housing. Chinatown has a lot of it. Chinatown is like the poster child of like a successful urbanist's dream. 20-minute walkable neighborhood. You work in the restaurant over there. You live in the rooming house across the way. And there's all of this like incredibly dense and invisible, you don't really notice it, but Chinatown has a lot of these like mid-rise and small multifamily houses. So being able to describe the building types also gave us more confidence advocating to the urban planning sector about why Chinatown is really worth preserving. Now, back to the associations that I was talking about earlier. Here are some photos of some of the frontages that you would expect to see. There's association signage in the front. You would see it often being multilingual. Some of this is using classical Chinese, so I don't even understand it, as I only can read modern Chinese. And this became so interesting because when we knocked on the doors, we were able to interview some of the people who had lived in these association buildings and some of the leadership, just casually. But it wasn't the central focus of our first research project. So when we had an opportunity to put together another proposal to BSH, it was like, let's dive into this. This is juicy. There's something here, because the uncle that we were able to talk to on the porch, he said he lives here for free. There is no deeper housing affordability than living somewhere for free in a downtown context. And he loves his room. It's very sunny, and he imagines himself living out the rest of his days in that room. So we were thrilled to have this approved for a second partnership. And the central research question there was, what is the role of family and clan associations, also known as benevolent societies, also known as civic fraternities? The English media and English archival materials have tried to describe these societies with 1,000 different terms. And so working on the terminology and glossary in and of itself was a bit of our current research process, and talking to other people interested in association history, what English words they use to describe this. The overall unifying word that we've run with so far, for now, is tongs, which would be my Cantonese pronunciation of tang, which I just said in Mandarin instead. Which are all roughly the same thing, hard to explain in a short sentence. But what were their collective impacts on affordability in Toronto's Chinatown? So there's archives we could go through, but we knew would be limited because very little has actually been written about their impact on affordability and land stewardship specifically. Most histories of Chinese Canadian history, Asian Canadian history, Chinatown history in Canada has mostly been focused on writing about, their role in newcomer settlement, mutual aid, their roles in cultural retention, their roles in advocacy and politics, but not so much literally how did they own their buildings together, which would be of interest to a group like us, which is a community land trust. So we were like, let's train some community researchers and go and conduct some semi-structured interviews and see what people say. So we're in the middle of the write-up process for that. But right off the bat, immediately, first stab into the City of Toronto archives, I found some urban planning documents that literally lit my hair on fire. I was incensed. I was so incensed by the way that the first Chinatown expropriation process actually had clearly cataloged the definition of both tongs, but also Chinese ownership, of course, in order to decide how much money they should throw in their direction and force this whole entire expropriation to happen. So I was finding very harmful archives that were not actually owned by community or from community necessarily, but I did find kind of the white supremacist catalog of how they were thinking about Chinatown's property ownership at that time. And you can see the conclusive report sent to City Council by Director Hafid. I don't know who this person was. The first sentence: Chinatown is not a residential community anymore. Out of more than 6,000 Chinese persons living in the metropolitan area, there are only 175 to 200 persons residing in Chinatown. This cannot have been true. This absolutely would have been an attempt to justify that it was permissible for them to erase an entire community in this way. So I don't know what else to tell you in terms of actually conducting the interviews. There is nothing more magical as a research process that we have been able to experience. Also then building trust through those interview processes, showing them that we're being respectful about their consent and what information we are willing to share, and also what information that they absolutely have control over if they do not wish to share with the public in this way. And just getting really generous tours from elders who have committed their whole life to Watong. So if I were to try and describe it after we've done this project, I would say a mutual aid society is a more true translation in my mind because of the values and purpose of what they constitute. Henry Yu, who teaches out at UBC, uses a different term, which is fictitious kinship, to describe the role of some of these associations. Whether you were deciding to be each other's kin because you shared an interest in opera, or whether it was because you all came from, this certain region of Canton, or whether you all happen to have the last name Wong, you're deciding to be each other's chosen family. So some of these, because they use family surnames as the basis of the commonality, they call themselves family associations or clan associations. And in some other instances, you'll see something like Cantonese Opera Society, but they also operate exactly and almost like any other association hall would, and you shouldn't imagine it as if it was some kind of art-specific studio space. So I have found in Ontario, they have often incorporated as nonprofit organizations, which is not always true across other jurisdictions in Chinatowns around the world. But they often, in the archives that we have been able to find, have a clear mandate in their articles of incorporation that showcase exactly how the property structure is meant to be run. So retail is meant to be income. So if you can rent that out, ideally it's to someone in the community to run something like, a supermarket that provides culturally relevant goods. But if not, that's fine. The rent from the commercial unit subsidizes a lot of the funding that would fund this mutual aid activity. Free or very deeply affordable housing in the rooms upstairs on the third floor or second floor for members in the back was often offered to people that were newly arrived as like a couch to crash on almost, until you got set up and found a place of your own that you preferred better. And there's often a shared common area, either on the very top floor where there would be an ancestral altar or photos of the association, and a community kitchen where on the weekends, everybody, regardless of whether you live in the house or not, would gather to feast together and also probably play some mahjong. So if I were to use the most annoying urbanism terms to describe this model, I would say I'm describing like an over 100-year-old, very successful, deeply assisted and co-living model in a 15-minute walkable intergenerational neighborhood. Like, I cannot enthuse more why this would be a housing advocate nerd's dream living model. And yet we have proven in Chinatown that this works. This really works and has worked for more than 100 years. And so we've continued doing this work outside of and also in the context of this research project being possible. Some of the community researchers we hired to be a part of this project have gone on to spin off even larger projects. For example, Four Winds Mahjong now runs weekly Wednesday Mahjong gatherings for novices and beginners without any gambling who are intimidated but want to learn and practice the game every Wednesday in the Wong Association space, which you see in this photo here. It's a beautiful hall that they have on a very large property facing directly onto Spadina. And speaking with these elders in the semi-structured interviews has just been a pure gift. This is my last slide, and I'll just say something that we learned. One elder said to us, and I'll just anonymize this and also paraphrase since we're in the middle of our writing and consent process, that if the government is not taking care of you. So in the Chinese Exclusion Act, your people are entirely abandoned. You have no civil rights. If the government is not going to take care of you, then you have to take care of each other. That's one element of mutual aid that I think is a real true lesson for community land trusts and our viability of how we imagine the stewardship of community housing to work in the future. And another person, really enthused to us, the commonwealth, the common pool of money is not for any one person's gain or benefit. And that really speaks to, I guess, the true meaning of what using land for community benefit really, really could look like. And so thank you all for listening. That's a little glimpse into some of the research activity we have been doing. And I'm so happy to take questions from you all.
Thank you so much, Chi. What a great presentation. For everyone on the call, my name is Sarah Lewis, and I'd just like to thank my colleague Lena for stepping in when I had technical difficulties earlier. Chi, we have a couple of questions for you, and we'd love to get your take on a couple of these, these questions. The first one asks, they'd love to hear more about how you recruited community members, particularly young people, to be researchers for this project.
Very fun. Also, if you don't know where it is, at the bottom of the Zoom panel, there's a Q&A button where you can submit more. I'm sad that you can't see each other in the chat. Thank you for this question. So to recruit community researchers, I think it depends on each effort and wave. So we recruited and thought about different people in community that we knew who would be interested in different tasks. So for example, hiring a community researcher or an RA, a community member who happens to be a student at U of T or UBC, let's say, and that we could conveniently rope in to become a research assistant is also part of this. And so the line between research assistant and community researcher is very blurry. So we would look at someone who seems really invested in Chinatown long term. So this isn't just like a summer gig for them, or isn't just like a thing that they're going to do and then disappear. It's someone who seems like they've already expressed they're already voluntarily interested in doing this kind of community development work, or has specific language skills that we need. That was the other like big metric in terms of thinking about who to reach out to become our community researchers, and in the end, who we decided to hire. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Our next question asks, do you feel that the community models in Chinatown could work in areas with less ethnic cohesion?
I ask myself that question often. I think this is a really, really good question. And I actually think no, and that's okay. Because I think you see queer collectives forming their own collectives. You see different identity-based community land trusts coalescing a democratic base. And you see all sorts of naturally occurring things, whether it's by religion or by some dimension of someone's identity. There needs to be this one part. And the only thing I will say is that I don't think it needs to be an ethnic-based cohesion, but I do think there needs to be some compelling shared identity that drives people wanting to come back and feel like they belong somewhere finally in a larger society where they don't feel they always belong, a place where you can just relax and kind of not explain where you're from. That, yes, I do find is true. But I am really wary of this because I really find that I find that most housing nerds or urban planners are really romanticize like social democracies where they're not critical of those social democracies being very monolithic in their citizenship base. I'm thinking about the Scandinaves. People really talk about how bikeable and walkable Copenhagen is, or how incredible the affordability of, like public housing is in some of these Nordic countries. But do you know how difficult becoming a citizen is in those contexts? And so I don't think we have like a satisfying answer of what would a democratically controlled housing model in a pluralistic, truly multicultural society look like and be sustainable in the long term. Chinatown in and of itself is very, very diverse. I should say that. I didn't really get a chance to dive. We've talked about this more in other presentations publicly, but Chinatown speaks so many different dialects and languages that there's difference across ourselves in intra community as well. But the shared identity comes from white supremacy, right? Because there is this overlay of policy that was the Exclusion Act or the Chinese Immigration Act that was indiscriminate about whether you were actually Chinese. A lot of other Asian looking folks just got caught in the big net. That becomes the basis of solidarity because of how you're being treated wrongly, but doesn't necessarily come from some like imagined romantic unity that's perfectly cohesive at all. So 3 different ways to answer that question. Wonderful question. Thank you for that question.
Yes, thank you for that question. Our next question asks, do you feel that there are findings from this research that can be helpful tools for other family associations, tongs in other cities with different legal contexts, or trends of nonprofits incorporation, like Montreal's Chinatown?
I really hope so. Yeah. For the research team that is on the call, take this question away. We're thinking about how to best format our reporting out from the Family Association interviews right now as we speak. We're struggling with the drafts of where it could go. And we don't believe that like a 40-page nonprofit report PDF will probably be the best way to absorb it. We really have the question asker's specific case in mind. I know that they work for our sister organization, JA Foundation, in Montreal, who recently acquired a building in partnership with a community member. And we have very shared challenges under both like the way private property operates in Canada, and then differently across different provinces. So absolutely, I think there's a lot of advice about the actual practices and governance that will be the most useful for other groups thinking about other Chinatowns. And it doesn't have to be a community land trust. Those practices could be practiced by many other housing providers or community organizations that see themselves as community developers, rather than necessarily a housing co-op or something like that, that are portable. Definitely portable. So excited to report out.
Amazing. We're excited to see that. Based on your experience as the executive director of TCLT, who's also worked with other CLTs, what unique opportunities do Chinatown family associations bring to the CLT movement specifically?
I really like this edit that we don't have to be presuming that we're bringing in any innovation or newness in introducing a community land trust into all sorts of, I imagine, working class and low income communities across these lands. I imagine the lesson from family associations is that mutual aid works. Like everything has to come back to a political mutual aid. Like they didn't just like provide each other free services. They advocated against the head tax. They took protests to Ottawa. They funded many different, often competing campaigns to achieve better civic outcomes and civil rights for many people, protested wars. And so they were not, just here to hand out food for those who are more needy or do things from the lens of charity. Mutual aid in a way that activates people and brings them back to the association to fuel even more energy to make the next mobilization happen to affect change on the broader scale. That to me is what I really hope the community land trust movement learns. Because if we start veering more towards charitable and nonprofit housing models, a charitable logic is fundamentally a different source of motivation and value than mutual aid logic. I think that's what I'm trying to get to. And I really hope the community land trust remains democratic and has an eye on defining what it means to be transformative and affecting broader change and how the real estate system works, rather than just, carving out and escaping with a little bit of property for you and yourself and your members, and then not really doing anything else for the rest of society.
Totally. We have a question here that's a little bit more practical. They are asking for resources that they can read to help untangle community land trusts on Indigenous land, because they're struggling with the idea of owning land and they don't know if their ethics are stopping them from contributing to their own community want of a land trust.
Yeah, you are asking the same question we asked when we started our first BSH project. Like a huge prong of our research proposal to BSH was like, okay, so we're all just going to become our own landlords now. on Indigenous land? Like, is that the vision for the movement? Is that what we're trying to fight for in terms of transformative affordable housing? And that didn't seem satisfying at all. And yet at the same time, our grandmas are actively being evicted in real time. So like, also being in this kind of philosophical quandary was also not helping anybody, because we were so hung up about it. We were really like, we don't want to incorporate the land trust. We don't know the answer to this. And expecting a perfect answer, I think, is the trap. I think there is important things. So first, yes, the network has published, actually one of them, a BSH paper with Maggie Lowe, and a series of interview results, interviewing Indigenous practitioners of CLTs. So we should know that there are actually Indigenous-led CLTs, and there are also Indigenous members of local CLTs that aren't necessarily exclusively Indigenous. And then there is this like broader question of like, if it is an Indigenous-led CLT, is that a land back project? And some people in the land back movement really don't feel that way, and some people really do. They would see taking property off of the private market as just the first step into this larger abolitionist future where we imagine true land back for everybody, and all of our civil rights being, governed with significant and meaningful Indigenous sovereignty on these lands. I think it's like being willing to follow and engage with Indigenous stewardship and like leadership, like taking direction and leaving lots of space in your project to be totally injected with a totally different direction than what you thought you had invested all the energy towards, is the best attitude to bring if you're starting a new CLT or thinking about what to put your energy on, and really cognizant that there is not yet sufficient or satisfying Indigenous engagement in the structure of your project. So remaining self-critical, but also doing some things and not expecting perfectionism is the best approach.
100%. And I just want to make a shout out to the chat. Alina's put in a link to the research that she was referring to. And we also have many other incredible research papers related to CLTs, also focusing on BIPOC-led CLTs. So there's lots to discover. We have one more question, I believe. To date, what has the City of Toronto's response been to your work? You had mentioned the community consultations that didn't feel they were really giving a voice to the community or presumably integrating feedback in a real material way, which is a valid and common criticism. Has the relationship improved? Do you see a potential for funding support from the city in the future? Or what is the type of funding that would impact or potentially compromise the mission?
I don't think the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust can take all the credit for it. Friends of Chinatown Toronto still remains an independent and grassroots organization, arm's length away from our CLT, as much as they were our mothership originally. They have been able to force all sorts of response from the system, actually, both bureaucrats and political staff and politicians themselves at the municipal level, volunteering and putting forth initiatives in a desperate response to respond to the amount of community power they were able to amass. So they were very effective. Not necessarily that they believe in it or want it, but there is now a first ever Chinatown area study, which is a planning process that initiates a range of other processes. We're live in the middle of that now. That was directly in response to Friends of Chinatown's advocacy. And then we have a mayor who ran on a platform of funding the MURA, which is the multi-unit residential acquisition fund, which community land trusts are eligible for, to the tune of $100 million, which she has not yet been able to apparently find the money to do, but she did run on a very public platform to do that. And that speaks to, I think, the success of the community land trust movement, really being able to communicate the difference between them and other nonprofit solutions, which is to say, like, this is community governed, democratically controlled, and something meaningfully different, and also able to permanently steward affordability, because we're taking that land off of the real estate market forever. So Chinatown is able to like straddle both of these policy responses. Now there is advocacy for a provincial acquisition fund to assist us in acquiring more land under community ownership. There is also, of course, a federal acquisition fund that's already live, along with the $1 billion and more cooperative housing development fund, cooperative housing obviously being very close friends with the CLT movement. So lots, there's been actually a shocking amount of like government response to both the CLT movement and also advocacy in Chinatown, but there definitely needs to be more, because I think we're still trying to use old tools of the planning system to address a need in Chinatown that can't be solved with a planning framework. Yeah.
Amazing. Chi, thank you so much for being here today. If any of our viewers would like to revisit this research in progress webinar, you'll be able to find the recording on our website in the coming days, and we encourage you to reach out to us or Chi if you have any further questions. To learn more about our research, including research on today's topic, visit our website at bsh.ubc.ca and stay up to date with all things balanced supply of housing by signing up for our newsletter or following us on social media, links to which you can find in the chat. Again, Chi, thank you so much for your support today, and we look forward to seeing the rest of the research in the coming months.
Thank you all.